Well, thank you for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be with you, and I really want to thank Rahim Shayagan and Marissa Stevens for the invitation and for making all the arrangements to make this possible. I have to actually begin by saying how wonderful it is to be giving this talk at UCLA, since I completed my PhD there in 2003 in the history department. And it's remarkable how quickly time passes, and I spent a decade on the UCLA campus between the NELC department and the history department and the Young Research Library and of course Laval Commons. So thank you for the invitation, and it's really nice to be able to be back home, as it were, even if it's only virtually. I'm especially happy to be able to share with you some ideas from my recently completed book, just published by the University of Texas Press in June of 2020. This is actually my second monograph. My first book, Nationalizing Iran, was published in 2008, and that's what grew out of my UCLA dissertation. But this is my second monograph, and it's the result of about a decade of work, so I'm very glad that it's now complete and available for you all and out in the world. The title of the book is the same as the title of this talk, and what I hope to do, maybe in the next 40 minutes or so, is to provide you with an overview of the book. And of course, there's a great deal in the book that I won't be able to discuss with you today, but what I'm hoping to do at least is to touch on what I think are some of the book's principal, both conceptual and empirical highlights, and to provide you with an introduction or maybe a summary of the book, and hopefully encourage you to read the book. So let me begin by describing some of the book's key ideas, and then I'll describe the content of the individual chapters. In the broadest sense, the book traces the history of the social, cultural, and intellectual exchange that took place between the Zoroastrian Parsi Community of India and the community of modern Iranian nationalist intellectuals during the early 20th century. And as I argue in the book, it was this exchange between Indian Parsis and modern Iranian intellectuals that played an important role in fostering a revival of antiquity in 20th century Iranian culture, and ultimately contributing to what became the official nationalism of the Pahlavi monarchy between 1925 and 1979. So, to put it most succinctly, the book makes a connection between the diaspora nationalism of the Indian Parsis and the official nationalism that took place in 20th century Iran. I realize most of you are specialists, but I should just say briefly, just by way of context, that Zoroastrianism was, of course, the pre-Islamic religion of Iran. And after the 7th century Islamic conquest, most Iranians gradually converted to Islam. A small minority of Zoroastrians remained inside Iran. Another portion of the Iranian Zoroastrian community emigrated from Iran and traveled to the subcontinent. And this community of migrants eventually became known in India by the ethnonym Parsi, named after the Pars or Fars region from where they had originally migrated. And I can show you some images that go along with this, and that's actually the book itself, the cover. This is a map of the world that I'm talking about here, this Iran-India world and its connection through the Indian Ocean context. This gives you a little bit more of a geography of what I'm looking at here. The western coast of India in particular is where sort of this migrant community ended up. Let me actually stop there. Contact between Iranians and Parsis diminished over the subsequent centuries. But the Parsis nevertheless retained at least some sense of their historic displacement from Iran. In fact, the 16th century Qisseh Sanjan narrative is certainly one example of this residual Parsi memory of displacement from Iran. And the so-called Revayat epistolary literature between Zoroastrian priests in Iran and India is another example of some continuing contact and awareness between the two communities in the post-migration centuries. But these were most likely the exceptions, and the more clearly discernible historical trend is a decline of interaction between the two communities. And it's really only in the 19th century that Parsis began to think of themselves, probably for the first time, as an exilic or diaspora community, long separated from their original national homeland of Iran. And it's also, I should say, by the 19th century that the Parsis had become one of the favored and most prosperous communities in British India. The Parsis, in fact, played an important role in a number of important global industries of the era, including the textile, shipping, and banking industries, as well as commercial agriculture. And I can show you some more images just to give you a sense of a prosperous Parsi family in India during this time. As a result of their success, by the 19th century, the Parsi community had become a prosperous community, and the city of Bombay became a commercial hub for a global Parsi trading network that stretched from Bombay throughout the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea and beyond. Now, my book only tells a very small portion of this much larger global history of the Parsis, and I only focus on really one social cultural outcome that grew out of this remarkable era of Parsi prosperity, and that's the renewal of contact and engagement between Parsis and Iranians after this long period of diminished interaction. In fact, the great prosperity that the Parsis had achieved by the 19th century motivated civic-minded members of the community to engage in charity and philanthropic work, especially towards their now impoverished Zoroastrian co-religionists still living inside Iran. And it's in this context that contact between Parsis and Iranians gained new momentum during the 19th century. And this is also where the history that I detail in the book really begins. Parsi philanthropy towards Iran's Zoroastrian community began originally in the mid-19th century with the work of the first Parsi emissary to Iran, Menakji Limji Hataria. His story is relatively well known, and I don't spend too much time on that topic in the book, but the Parsi philanthropy and engagement with Iran accelerated significantly in the early 20th century, especially in the 1920s and 30s during the Reza Shah period. And this is the period that I primarily focus on in the book. And so the first of the key ideas that I try to develop in the book is that what really began as Parsi charity or Parsi philanthropy in the 19th century, efforts such as rebuilding fire temples and providing medical services to the Zoroastrian communities of Kerman and Yazd, those efforts very quickly evolved to become a much more significant cultural and intellectual engagement between Parsis and Iranians during the early 20th century. And most of the individual chapters of the book detail this transition from Parsi religious charity towards Iran towards a broader cultural and intellectual exchange between Parsis and Iranians. And the effect of this cultural exchange was ultimately to spark a broader Iranian curiosity about Zoroastrianism and Iran's pre-Islamic heritage among an emerging class of Iranian literati, activists, and nationalist intellectuals. Another key idea that I develop in the book, and maybe this is the second one, is the historiographic question of how we identify the intellectual origins of neoclassicism in modern Iran. And here I'm trying to build on the ideas that go back all the way to the work of Marshall Hodgson and others more recently, including Mohammad Tavakkoli, Catherine Babayan, Niall Green, Monica Ringer, Mana Kia, Kevin Schwartz, and others, to argue that in order to identify the origins of modern Iranian neoclassicism, we need to transcend the historiographic divide separating Iranian studies and South Asian studies, and instead try to situate Iran's modern cultural and intellectual history within a larger trans-regional Persianate geography. Within Iranian historiography, however, the usual explanation is to locate the intellectual origins of Iranian neoclassicism to the influence of European Orientalist knowledge on modern Iranian thought. And clearly, the study of the ancient Near East, including the fields of history and philology, comparative religion, archaeology. These were all central preoccupations of Oriental studies at European universities in the 19th century. And it remains commonplace to trace the origins of Iranian neoclassicism to the intellectual influence of these European systems of knowledge. And my point in the book is not to contradict these arguments, which I think are well documented, but my goal is to add another layer of complexity to this history, with the hope of trying to decenter the historiography of modern Iranian intellectual history away from a narrowly Eurocentric preoccupation, and instead try to describe a cultural genealogy of Iranian neoclassicism that accounts for a broader set of cultural and intellectual entanglements of Iranian thought with multiple systems of knowledge, in addition to the tradition of British, French, and German Orientalism. And so one of the key ideas in the book is that in order to understand the revival of antiquity in modern Iran, we also need to account for the Iranian encounter with the Parsis of India, as well as the broader context of the decline of the early modern Persianate cultural system. And as I argue in the book, the culture of Iranian antiquity was one of the strands of culture that already existed within a Persianate system. And as that Persianate system began to unravel in the 19th and early 20th century, this Parsi-inspired strand within the Persianate system became increasingly disentangled from its earlier early modern cultural fabric and was now reordered and redefined and newly empowered to serve as the basis of new understandings of history, culture, and belonging. And perhaps the most creative and enduring of these post-Persianate cultural projects was the neoclassical revival that produced the culture of 20th century Iranian nationalism, especially during the 5+ decades of the Pahlavi monarchy. Now, let me add one more key idea that I'd like to highlight from the book, and that's the book's focus on the social, material, and economic mechanisms that enabled the Parsi engagement with Iranians. And as I detail in the book, in addition to philanthropic motives, the Parsi-Iranian encounter was greatly facilitated by a number of new technologies of the era. The first was steam-powered navigation of the Indian Ocean, and the second was the proliferation of new industrialized print technologies. And here I'm especially building on the work of Niall Green in his book Bombay Islam to help trace how steam and print, as novel material mechanisms, facilitated the circulation of peoples, books, and ideas within the Indian Ocean world of the early 20th century. In particular, I traced the publication and circulation history of a new genre of books with neoclassical themes. These were books that were published in Bombay by Zoroastrian publishing houses associated with Parsi civic organizations, and books that were intended for export to the growing print marketplace inside Iran. And as I detail in the book, very often these books from Bombay were distributed free of charge in a quasi-missionary way inside Iran. And this is what I call in the book not print capitalism, as Benedict Anderson famously described, but rather a form of what I would call print philanthropy that was inspired and probably modeled after the publishing efforts of Christian missionaries in India. So the book is not only about ideas as abstractions, but I also try to detail how these ideas were produced and circulated in their social and material form as books. Now, to illustrate some of these ideas, let me select some examples from the 5 chapters of the book to give you a sense not only of the conceptual arguments, but of the empirical arguments as well. And all of these examples reflect the overall focus of the book, which is on the movement of peoples and books and ideas between Parsis and Iranians during the early 20th century. The first example comes from the life and work of Keykhosrow Shahrokh, which is detailed in chapter 1 of the book, and I can show you, there he is. Keykhosrow Shahrokh played a very important role in connecting the Parsi culture of Bombay to the emerging culture, the modern culture inside Iran. He's a well-known figure in Iran's early 20th century political history. He was an elected member of the Majlis, where he served as the designated Zoroastrian representative from 1909 until his death in 1940. He was born into an impoverished Iranian Zoroastrian family in 1874 in the town of Kerman. He was, of course, not a Parsi, but was from the small local Zoroastrian community remaining inside Iran. But his life was changed by coming into contact with the Parsis while still very young. He received his early education in Kerman at a primary school built through Parsi charities. He later traveled to Tehran to continue his education, funded through Parsi scholarships. And most importantly, when he reached his late teens, he traveled to Bombay with Parsi assistance to continue his education. The commercialization of steam travel made a journey from Iran to India for educational purposes much more convenient by the turn of the 20th century. As a result, Shahrukh studied at one of the famous Parsi schools in Bombay, one of the Parsi benevolent schools that was established in the mid-19th century. And this school primarily enrolled students from the growing Parsi middle class of Bombay and had as its basis a curriculum defined by a reformed and modernized Zoroastrianism. Most significantly, after completing his studies in Bombay, Shahrukh wrote 2 books, and I can show you these books. The first is called the Aine Mazdayasna, which is structured really as a catechism, and that's what you see on the left there. It poses basic questions about the faith and provides succinct and authoritative answers. Shahrukh also wrote a second book, the Furuq Mazdayasna, which includes a series of introductory essays on Zoroastrianism written by Shahrukh himself. These 2 books were written between 1907 and 1909 and were published with the help of Parsi philanthropists and book publishers in both Tehran and Bombay. They had significant circulation inside Iran and were in fact often given away for free, especially to non-Zoroastrians. Additionally, they were also used as textbooks in the growing number of Iranian Zoroastrian schools. These 2 books also played a very important role as early examples of a Parsi-inspired modern Iranian neoclassicism. They were written in Persian and were intended for an audience of readers as primers on Zoroastrianism, written from a modernist and reformist perspective. The intended audience was both Iranian Zoroastrians and, at least as importantly, non-Zoroastrian Iranian readers. Both of Shahrukh's books produced a radically new interpretation of Zoroastrianism for Iranian readers that tried to dispel what were now understood as misunderstandings of Zoroastrianism born of prejudice and pre-modern religious polemics. Zoroastrianism was defined by Shahrukh as a monotheistic faith that was rooted in an ethical system that was compatible with modernity and one which de-emphasized religious law, priestly authority, and ritual. Instead, the themes of ethical monotheism, as well as universalism, pluralism, and ecumenism, were very pronounced in both of these books. Shahrukh, like his Parsi teachers in Bombay, was constructing what we might call a kind of Zoroastrian Protestantism that was now compatible with normative notions of religion as understood in the early 20th century, and which also romanticized pre-Islamic Iranian history as a proto-modern golden age worthy of revival. For non-Zoroastrian readers inside Iran, these 2 books played an important role in piquing the curiosity of their interest regarding Iran's classical history and pre-Islamic faith. Now, let me say something about the life and work of Din Shah Irani, who is the subject of Chapter 2, and this figure that you see here. The story of Din Shah Irani is similar to Kaykhosro Shahrukh's, although he is perhaps less often remembered or acknowledged within Iranian historiography. Irani was perhaps the most important Bombay-based intermediary between Parsis and Iranians. He was trained as a lawyer in British India, and was in fact a partner in one of colonial Bombay's leading law firms. But in addition to his legal practice, he was also deeply involved in civic and charity work. And among his most important civic accomplishments in Bombay was the establishment of a number of important Parsi organizations, and the most important one of which was the Iran League, which he helped to establish in 1922, and I can give you some images from the Iran League there. The mission of the Iran League was to move beyond just philanthropy, and you can see their aims and objectives statement there, and move beyond just philanthropy and to begin building broader cultural, commercial, and political ties between Parsis and Iranians. And Din Shah Irani was central to the work of the Iran League. The Iran League also published a bilingual Persian-English journal known as the Iran League Quarterly that you also see there, which circulated widely, both within India and in Iran and elsewhere, including Europe, North America, as well as East Asia. The articles in the Iran League Quarterly included reformist interpretations of Iranian history, including many articles about the renewal of interest in Zoroastrianism inside Iran. This was also the journal that published Sadiq Hidayat's first published his essays in Persian and the translations of some of his Pahlavi texts during his time in Bombay, where he was also, of course, writing The Blind Owl. In the English language section of the journal, there were also many articles encouraging Parsi entrepreneurs to invest in Iran. The Parsis clearly understood Iran's potential for economic growth, especially in areas where the Parsis had experience in success, such as in the textile industry and in commercial agriculture. Din Shah Irani was very involved in encouraging these Parsi economic initiatives towards Iran. Like Shah Rukh, Din Shah Irani also wrote two very important books of his own. These were books intended for general audiences inside Iran, and these are the cover pages: the Akhlaq-e-Iran Bastan and the Falsafe-e-Iran Bastan. Both of these books reflect the same Neo-Zoroastrian revivalism that was at the heart of the Parsi-Iranian exchange. The books also reflected a fascination with universalist ideas derived from the then popular Theosophical Society, which was thriving in India at the time, as well as Victorian-era speculative scientific ideas. And I'll just give you some examples here. There were popular notions during the Victorian era claiming that Zoroastrian theology had anticipated many recent scientific discoveries, including discoveries of Newtonian physics and Darwinian biology. There was, in fact, a deep fascination with Zoroastrianism as an example of a perennial philosophy that was both very ancient and yet compatible with modern science, and the Theosophical Society promoted this idea as well. These ideas found their way into Iranian conceptions of Zoroastrianism via these Parsi sources, and helped to further arouse curiosity and interest in Iran's classical heritage. What made these books important was not only their content, but also the manner in which they circulated. By the 1930s, the number of modern bookstores in Tehran had greatly increased, and these Zoroastrian books published in Bombay gained a readership inside Iran's growing print marketplace. In fact, the Iran League had sponsored the publication of Din Shah Irani's books, specifically for export to Iran. And both of these books went through multiple editions during the 1930s in particular. Now, let me highlight another key episode of the Parsi-Iranian exchange of the early 20th century, and in this case, the visit to Iran in 1932 by the Indian poet and Nobel Prize literature winner Rabindranath Tagore. And Tagore's visit to Iran in 1932 is the subject of chapter 3 of the book, and let me show you. There's Tagore. Tagore was not a Parsi. He was a Reformed Hindu who wrote in Bengali. He had a wide-ranging cultural and intellectual curiosity. He's often described as one of the founders of modern India alongside Gandhi. He was known principally for his poetry, and he was in fact the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. In 1932, Tagore visited Iran at the invitation of Reza Shah's government. And significantly, it was the Parsi Community of Bombay and the Iran League who first proposed the visit as a way to build further ties between Iran and India. Din Shah Irani was, in fact, the instrumental figure in proposing and planning Tagore's visit, and he, in fact, accompanied Tagore during Tagore's 2-week tour of Iran. And let me show you a couple of images here. Here is Tagore with the Iranian Literary Society. Here is Tagore visiting the tomb of Hafez in Shiraz. This is before the tomb was redesigned in its contemporary form. By 1932, Tagore had achieved the status of a global celebrity, and by the time of his trip to Iran, he had spent more than 2 decades traveling the world as a cultural ambassador for his own unique vision of global solidarity. The book goes into detail about Tagore's time in Iran, and I'll emphasize maybe 3 brief points here as they relate to the Parsi-Iranian exchange. First, Tagore's 1932 trip to Iran was itself an example of the larger theme of cultural circulation between Iran and India. Here, the cultural commodity that was being exchanged wasn't books. Instead, the commodity of cultural exchange was Tagore himself. Tagore conveyed his own cultural capital, and the ease with which he was able to travel to Iran from India enabled the dissemination of his message. In this case, Tagore didn't travel by steamship, but actually by air. And by 1932, commercial air travel was also among the emerging industries fostering connections between Iran and India. Second, let me say something about the message that Tagore brought with him to Iran. That message was essentially the same message that the Parsis themselves wished to convey towards Iran, which was that Iran and India were part of a common civilizational ideal rooted in the shared classical heritage of Sanskrit, Vedic, and Avestan culture. Tagore repeatedly made references to this idea throughout his tour of Pahlavi Iran. It was a symbolic message that was intended to include Iranians as part of Tagore's vision of a broader Pan-Asian cultural universalism. The third significance of Tagore's visit to Iran was that it publicly enacted the idea of return and the negation of exile. Throughout his trip to Iran, Tagore was repeatedly presented to his Iranian audiences as a long-lost ancestor who was returning home after a long exile. This message also was precisely how Iranian nationalists and the Parsis of India saw their own relationship. The Parsi community's rediscovered connection to Iran was increasingly tied to a longing for return, remigration, and repatriation to Iran. And I can show you one image that captures that idea as well. This is from an image in the Iran League Quarterly. There was, in fact, extensive discussion within the Parsi community during the 1920s and the 1930s in particular regarding plans for a possible large-scale return and resettlement to Iran by the Parsis. These discussions also included the possibility of purchasing land, especially in the Khuzestan province, for the creation of a Parsi settler colony. Tagore's trip to Iran symbolically enacted this idea of Parsi remigration to Iran and this negation of exile. Now, the 4th chapter of the book focuses on the life and work of Ibrahim Purdavud and his connection to Iran. And I should say, when I began doing the research for this for this book. I never imagined I'd be giving a talk at the Pur Dawood Center at UCLA, so I think it's especially poignant that I'm giving this talk at UCLA. In the context of the argument that I make in the book, Ibrahim Pur Dawood's life and work can be described as really the most important outcome that grew out of the intellectual exchange between Iran and India in the interwar period. Pur Dawood is today acknowledged as one of the pioneering intellectual figures of 20th century Iranian neoclassicism. His major contribution to the intellectual history of Iranian nationalism was, of course, his translations of the Zoroastrian religious texts into the New Persian vernacular language of Iran. Since knowledge of Avestan and Pahlavi had declined inside Iran, Pur Dawood's translations had the effect of making the Zoroastrian religious texts available to Iranian readers for the first time in a language that they could read and understand. The chapter of the book details how Pur Dawood came to acquire the knowledge and the skills necessary to produce these translations. And what I argue is that it was Pur Dawood's engagement with Parsi scholars, activists, reformist priests, and lay intellectuals that laid the groundwork for his translations. When Pur Dawood is mentioned in Iranian historiography, it's usually mentioned in the context of his engagement with European Orientalist knowledge, and how this engagement served as the basis of his subsequent work. And of course, it's true that Pur Dawood spent considerable time in Berlin during the Weimar period, and he had important personal and intellectual relationships with German scholars of Zoroastrianism. And I detail that in the book. But what remains under-acknowledged, especially in European language scholarship on modern Iranian intellectual history, is the larger trans-regional network of cultural and intellectual exchange between Iranians and Parsis that was also central to Ibrahim Pur Dawood's intellectual development. There were at least two important Parsi connections that I point out in this chapter of the book. The first is the important role that Madame Kama played in spurring Pur Dawood's curiosity about Zoroastrianism. Madame Kama was an activist and civic leader from a wealthy Parsi family. She was also the daughter-in-law of K.R. Kama, the most revered Parsi scholar of Zoroastrianism during the reform period of the late 19th and early 20th century. Madame Kama was also a major figure in the Indian independence movement, and one of the founders and supporters of the Free India Society and the Young India Society. As part of her political work, she was active in building political coalitions between Irish, Egyptian, Turkish, German, Russian, and Iranian activists and intellectuals. It was in this context that she came to know Ibrahim Pur Dawood. Pur Dawood met Madame Kama in Paris in 1913, when Pur Dawood had arrived in the city to continue his education. Pur Dawood himself later credits this meeting with Madame Kama as really a defining moment in his intellectual development. She encouraged his curiosities about Zoroastrianism and Iran's classical heritage. And it was from this meeting in 1913, when Pur Dawood was in his mid-20s, that he then set out to seriously study the Avestan and Pahlavi languages that would lead to much of his subsequent accomplishments. The second important encounter that Pur Dawood had with the Parsis was approximately a decade later in the 1920s, and that's part of what you're seeing here. By 1925, Pur Dawood had gained notoriety as the first modern Iranian to have mastered Avestan and Pahlavi. The Parsis in India had for some time been hoping to produce a readable, accessible translation of the Zoroastrian scriptures into modern Persian. And this was part of their larger project of promoting a new, modern understanding of the faith among Iranians. By 1925, it became clear that Ibrahim Pur Dawood was the ideal candidate for this project. The Iran League, again led by Din Shah Irani, reached out to and invited Pur Dawood to travel to Bombay, where he spent almost 3 years. During his time in Bombay in Western India, Pur Dawood collaborated closely with Parsi priests and scholars. And the result of these collaborations was a series of books in Persian, published in Bombay under Parsi auspices, all intended for export to the Iranian print marketplace. The most important of the books was undoubtedly Pur Dawood's modern Persian translation of the Gathas, translated and now made available in the poetic idiom of the modern Persian language, and I can show you some pages from that. This is the title page, and there's Pur Dawood in Bombay after his translation appeared. Here's a page from the Gathas as well in both the parallel Persian and Avestan texts. Pur Dawood's translation of the Gathas grew out of the encounter, engagement, encouragement, as well as the material support provided by the Parsi community of Bombay. The final chapter of the book focuses on the Parsi-sponsored Persian language newspaper published in Tehran called Iran-Abastan. This newspaper was founded by the journalist and activist Saif Azad, as he's famously known. The chapter goes into detail regarding Saif Azad's life and work, a figure about whom very little has been written in modern Iranian historiography. As I argue in the chapter, Saif Azad's life reflects the culturally fluid and politically dynamic nature of Iranian nationalism during the interwar period. What little has been written about Saif Azad has identified him as really the principal propagandist of the Nazi ideology in Iran during the 1930s. And while that's true, what I discovered during the course of the research for this book was that this is an incomplete accounting of Saif Azad. Saif Azad had spent a dozen years in Weimar Berlin, where his journalistic career began. He was principally an activist who advocated for independence movements across Asia. His first and most successful newspaper was a multilingual transnational newspaper called the Azadiya Sharq, which you see the masthead there, which combined anti-imperial political language with vocabulary borrowed from really an eclectic mix of Islamism, Bolshevism, nationalism, representing a kind of proto-third worldist ideology that would only become much more formalized after World War II. He was, in a way, ahead of his time, you could say. By the early 1930s, Saif Azad was seeking new patrons for his journalism and activism, and now he reached out to the Parsis of Bombay. He proposed to Parsi civic leaders the idea of publishing a newspaper in Persian from Tehran that would promote Parsi-Iranian relations. By this period, the Parsis were concerned about their future in India. It was unclear what their prospects would be in a post-independence India, as one of the most favored and most prosperous minority communities of the Raj. The idea of remigration to Iran was actually being discussed among Parsi civic leaders as a serious option, especially since there seemed to be a growing interest among Iranians regarding their Zoroastrian heritage. Saif Azad's overtures to the Parsis was accepted, and in early 1933, the newspaper Iran-Abastan began publication. The chapter goes into detail about the content of this newspaper. In short, during the first 9 months of the newspaper's life, the content of the newspaper was very favorable towards the Parsis. It featured biographies of prominent Parsis, and here's some pages that show that, and published numerous articles that promoted the idea of a Parsi return and repatriation to Iran. By the fall of 1933, however, the content of the newspaper changed, and it is from this period that Iran-Abastan became a mouthpiece of Nazi propaganda inside Iran. And I can show you a couple of images that illustrate that. Here's the masthead with the swastika now prominently adorned on it. Here's a typical page from this period showing photographs and stories about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. The new Nazi government in Germany, it seems, had recruited Saif Azad and began using the newspaper for its own purposes. But what is clear is that the origin of the newspaper and its original content was more focused on its Parsi patrons than on its later Nazi ones. And as I detail in the chapter, Saif Azad was himself a wily and opportunistic enough of a character that he agreed to realign the newspaper with the political interests of his new patrons, the Nazi government's foreign ministry. And I go into detail in the book regarding this. In some ways, his break between the Parsis and Saif Azad and the Iran-e-Bastan newspaper is emblematic of a larger tension that was at work in the Iran-Parsi relationship. And this is also one of the key ideas that runs throughout the book. While the growing contact between Parsis and Iranians had helped to build cultural, ideological, social, and economic bonds between Parsis and Iranians, the political goals of the two communities were ultimately very different. For the Parsis, liberal, pluralistic, ecumenical goals had always been central to their desire to reach out to their ancestral homeland. This was a political outlook that had been forged by the Parsi community's status as a prosperous minority community within British India. Inside Iran, however, the revival of antiquity as a cultural ideological project was always tied to the multiple political trajectories of Iranian nationalism, which included both a liberal democratic project of Iranian nationalism and a more conservative form of Iranian nationalism that had affinities with fascist politics. And by the mid-1930s, this more conservative or right-wing version of Iranian nationalism was becoming ascendant. Ultimately, part of the story that I try to tell in the book is that the Parsis and the Iranians were, in the end, despite all that they thought they shared, were ultimately unable to understand each other. And it was the shifting political contexts of Iran and India during the 1930s that prevented a permanent or enduring connection, much less a return or remigration to Iran by the Parsis. One final key idea to leave you with is that the history of Parsi-Iranian relations also suggests that the emerging historiographies that emphasize trans-regional networks of exchange should also be weary of reifying a telos of cosmopolitanism. The history of contact, exchange, and globalization, of course, isn't simply a narrative of liberal and multicultural triumphalism. Histories that seek to look beyond the artificial boundaries separating nations, regions, or areas of the world should also consider the complexity of newly established global connections and the unforeseen entanglements that those new networks of connection also produce. The Parsi-Iranian exchange certainly demonstrates this. And thank you. I think I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to engage with you later. Thank you.